I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you are safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual conversations, at least for now, on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm pleased and more than pleased, but honored to welcome former Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates, who needs no introduction, but he deserves one. So I will very briefly. Dr. Gates served as the 22nd U.S. Secretary of Defense, 2006 to 2011. He's the only Secretary of Defense in U.S. history to be asked to remain in office by a newly elected president. No small matter in these days. Dr. Gates served 8 U.S. presidents across both parties through various positions at CIA, on the NSC, National Security Council, and finally at the Pentagon. On Dr. Gates' last day in office, former President Barack Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor. Dr. Gates, welcome to Carnegie Connects. Your presence here couldn't be more timely.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Pleased to be with you.
I thought, maybe it's my bias as a former State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research analyst, that we'd start our conversation by talking a little bit first about your analysis of the current crisis. Before we get to Lenin's famous question of what is to be done, much of your early career focused on analysis and on Russia. And I know you'll agree that if you don't accurately assess the way the world is, the prospects that you're going to bend it in the direction you may want it to go isn't going to work out very well. And nowhere, I think, is intelligence analysis more difficult, but perhaps more germane than trying to assess the motives of one Vladimir Putin. You write in Duty that when your memoir, that second memoir, that when you first met Putin, you saw the eyes of a, quote, stone cold killer. He certainly lived up to that reputation. So what do you think as you assess, we're now 5-6 weeks into this savage and brutal Russian operation in Ukraine? What do you think initially Putin wanted to do? Miscalculations, misreading of the maps aside, what did he want?
Well, I think we have a pretty clear picture of what he wanted in the demands that he made many weeks before the war actually started, when he put forward the proposed agreement and essentially called for a change of government in Ukraine, for Ukraine to abjure ever becoming a member of NATO, and for NATO to move its lines back to where they stood in 1997. And those were sort of his positions, and I think that those still, he's clearly failed in those aspirations. But I think ultimately what he is about, as I've written, is not about reestablishing the Soviet Union, but initially, at least, going back to what was called Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is essentially the Slavic core of the old Soviet Union. So Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And I think he wants a more integrated, cohesive state comprising of those 3 entities. The rest, what the Russians would call the near abroad, the other former Soviet states, republics in Central Asia and the Baltic states and so on. I think in that near abroad, he would like to have predominant influence and have them essentially take a knee or bend a knee to Russia's aspirations and Russia's policy. So I think that beginning with his essay that he wrote, if you want to call it that, a year ago last summer, about Ukraine not being a country, going through the history, his version of the history, is pretty clear that he thinks that Ukraine has to be a part of Russia, and I think that continues to be his aspiration.
You know, you wrote in the Financial Times that as you argue now, that you thought formal reincorporation of the former Soviet Union was not his goal, that it was subservience to Russia, subservience basically to have national influence over two issues. One was democratization, or Ukraine and other former Warsaw Pact countries drifting west. And the other was the security dimension, NATO. After 6 weeks of what we've witnessed, it's clear to much of the world, now maybe we're wrong, it's clear to much of the world that he's not even going to be able to digest Ukraine. I guess the real question is it clear to Vladimir Putin that that is in fact not possible?
I think that question remains open, and I think it's premature to say that he has given up on his aspiration of taking Ukraine entirely. Clearly, his initial approach failed and failed miserably, and a lot of military mistakes were made, an incredible number of military mistakes. But that does not preclude Act Two. And we see that in preparation in the East, where it seems clear that his intent is to seize all of the Donbass. The republics of Luhansk and Donetsk really only comprise, I think, about 40% of the whole Donbass. And so he would like to take all of the Donbass, and then this land bridge, if you will, between Russia and Ukraine that involves taking the rest of taking much of the rest of the Black Sea coast, including Mariupol and perhaps maybe probably trying to seize Odessa. If he is successful in that arena, and the terrain in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Ukraine, is much more compatible with the use of armor, tanks, and so on than the western part of the country, then it seems to me, once he's established himself firmly in those areas, I wouldn't rule out that he then begins again to move to the west until he can at least force a change of government in Kyiv, just because of the destruction of the country and the paralysis of the country, and so the real issue is the will of the Ukrainian people, because I think this is going to go on for quite some time.
So success will breed success, in other words.
Well, that would certainly be his hope. And the question is, if the Ukrainians can fight him to a stalemate in the east, that would be, I think, an even more significant military achievement than what they've already accomplished, because the Russians are much closer to their supply depots. The Russian army is probably the most railroad dependent army of any major country. And once they get beyond their own rail depots, more than 50, 60, 70 miles, they begin to have significant logistical issues, because they have many fewer trucks per unit than most other armies. And so one of the problems they had in the West was they got too far out in front of their supply depots. So the question is, how successful can he be in the East, and then does he move on to Odessa and then continue to try and move to the West? And I think that's going to be the real challenge.
Right. And as in your reading of Putin, would you argue that this for him is an existential conflict, not so much in terms of Russian security, although I'm sure he defines Russian security and the survival of his regime in power as essentially one and the same. But is that the perception of Putin, that he is involved in a fight for his political life and success, even if it's somewhat less than he initially anticipated, but substantial, is absolutely critical?
Well, the historical record of Russian leaders who lose wars would not be encouraging for him.
Not good.
But
right.
I think he's obsessed with Ukraine, and I think that he's not going to let this go. We're hearing that he's kind of gotten into this Orthodox mysticism.
Right.
The people that he allows around him, incredibly limited basically his old security buddies or people from that world. Nothing captures that better than that photograph of him sitting at one end of a 40-foot table and his defense minister and chief of the Russian general staff sitting at the other end. And so I think he's obsessed with Ukraine. He's not going to let this thing go.
Yeah. Former National Security Advisor Zbig Brzezinski argued that without Ukraine, there is no Russian empire. And that would drive home the notion that, in fact, he must win, quote unquote. But I want to get to the issue of winning in a minute. What does that actually mean? We live, I think, on the edge here. And the risks of the use of chemical, biological, and we've even heard arguments made, the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield or even for demonstration effect has now become, not that it's likely necessarily, but it's now within the realm of conversation. What is your thinking on his deployment? There were reports yesterday of white phosphorus being used in Mariupol. It's going to take time to sort that out to see whether those are real chemical agents or what actually was deployed there. But what is your thinking on Putin's potential use of chemical, biological weapons?
Well, I think the reason that it's become a subject of conversation is that he himself raised it. He talked about the possibility of using nuclear weapons. He announced that he had increased the alert status of Russia's nuclear forces. Never mind that, at least as far as I can tell, from what I'm reading and hearing, we haven't seen submarines leaving ports. We haven't seen strategic bombers orbiting. We haven't seen mobile missiles being taken out of their sheds and so on. So I think this was largely for public relations purposes, and maybe as a warning to NATO to be sure and stay out of Ukraine. I think that this is one of those forecasts where it inevitably comes up and bites you back. But I think the odds of him using chemical or nuclear weapons is at this point pretty low, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, biological weapons are essentially uncontrollable. So right. I think that's kind of not in the cards. A chemical weapon is possible. I mean, we've seen the Russians use them before. We've seen them use them in Syria. We've seen them elsewhere. But I think there are not, at this point, with the sole exception of one area in Ukraine, not much of a mass of Ukrainian soldiers. So it's hard to see what the military target of a chemical weapon would be that would have strategic significance that would outweigh the potential international consequences of using those weapons.
Well, yeah.
And so the value, if you can call it that, of a chemical weapon is really as a terror weapon, as a means of trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And I think what we've seen so far is that we're actually past that moment. The Ukrainians have passed that test, and the use of chemical weapons, I think, would only add more steel to their spine at this point. With respect to a tactical nuclear weapon, I think crossing that threshold is a huge step for the first time since 1945. And again, what's the military value of it? It's really more of a terror weapon at this point. And the consequences of crossing that threshold are I think, pretty consequential. There's also another sort of factual factor, and that is the winds there blow from the west. So radiation from the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in eastern Ukraine is going to end up in Russia. So I think the odds are pretty low. They're not zero.
Yeah, and given the competency of Russian military performance, these are complicated weapons, binary agents that need to be combined. God only knows what the consequences would be, even for the Russians themselves. I asked the question about existential conflict and then the use of CW, BW, because in my own mind, I see a beleaguered Putin, which means that the West needs to prepare contingencies in the event that Putin becomes "quote unquote" desperate. Maybe that point is we're reaching that point now. But if in fact chemical weapons were to be used, the White House obviously is developing contingency plans. We know that both the Washington Post and the Times has reported. What options does NATO or the United States have in response? What would we do in the event, and we'll move beyond the whole Obama 2012 red line issue in Syria? What would we do if, in fact, such a weapon was deployed against civilian population centers, not against military, but as a terror weapon, as they employed it in Aleppo?
Yeah. I think the United States would not respond in kind. I think NATO would not respond in kind. I do think it would probably change the level of restrictions that NATO and the U.S. have placed on themselves in terms of the level of their assistance to the Ukrainians. So the use of a chemical weapon, and much more so a tactical nuclear weapon, I think would reopen the conversation about no-fly zones, about providing heavier equipment, much heavier and newer equipment to the Ukrainians, and so on. So I think that there would be some concrete strategic decisions made that would be more punitive to the Russians and frankly have much more consequence than simply responding in kind with a chemical weapon. I think it's just completely out of the question that the U.S. would use chemical weapons in response.
In response, and as long as we're on this subject of contingencies, the way Ukraine is being perceived and talked about in the West is the perception of a country that literally has become the kind of fulcrum of Western civilization. It's the hinge point now in a historic battle. The president has used this rhetoric between the forces of democracy on one hand and the forces of authoritarianism on the other. You now have mass killing of civilians, which the president himself has talked about, has characterized as genocide. And there are going to be major efforts to document these war crimes. If you had to, would you say that Ukraine is a vital American national interest? I'm going somewhere with this question, but it's troubled me because many people believe that we're not being tough enough. Our response is too risk averse. We need to be much more risk ready. The way we talk, however, not necessarily the way we're acting in views of many, suggests that Ukraine is a vital national interest. And if in fact it's a vital national interest, a president is obligated somehow to protect it or to ensure that the worst possible consequences do not develop, which leads me, of course, to the issue of how risk ready should we be?
Well, I think that's really the central question, and I think that the real heart of the issue, just to cut to the chase, is how prepared are we to directly militarily confront the Russians in Ukraine? If you define Ukraine as a vital United States interest, then you have to be willing to confront the Soviet Union. And as the president has said, and at that point, you're contemplating the possibility of World War III. And so while the outcome in Ukraine, I think, is really important to the United States, I think we have to be kind of careful about the rhetoric we use, lest we trap ourselves into a situation that moves us in a direction that actually isn't in the interest of the United States, which is a war with Russia. you can't be deterred by Putin's threats to use weapons of mass destruction. Otherwise, all Iran or North Korea or China needs to do to achieve their objectives is say, well, if you don't back off, we'll use nuclear weapons, and then if you back off, then you've lost the game. So you can't be deterred by the Russian threats, but you also have to be mindful of the risk of an escalation once you get into an actual conflict. People talk about a no-fly zone as though it's some kind of a video game, but the way the United States imposes a no-fly zone is, first of all, to go in and destroy all of the air defense systems of the other side. Well, that's fundamentally an attack on Russia.
Yeah.
And are we ready for that? So I think this is a very tough line that the administration has had to walk. And, members of Congress can talk about being tougher and doing tougher things and so on and so forth. But one of the benefits of being a member of Congress is that you bear no consequences for what you say, and you have no responsibility for what happens afterward. So you have lots of authority and a big microphone and no responsibility. So what the president has had to do is figure out, how do you walk this line to give the Ukrainians as much as you can to help them fight the Russians without dramatically increasing the risk of a war with Russia. Now, my view is that the administration was late in coming to arm the Ukrainians and was too cautious about the kinds of weapons that we were prepared to provide the Ukrainians. I think in many cases we've seen over the last number of weeks that the administration has sort of been pushed into the next level of sanctions, in no small part because of sentiment coming out of the Congress. And I like to point out to people, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have done something no other living human beings have done, and that is bring Republicans and Democrats together on Capitol Hill, from the far left, mostly the far left to the far right. So the president actually confronts a bipartisan sentiment in the Congress for both Russia and China that pushes him in a harder direction. And so I think he has walked that line pretty carefully. I think since it became clear last fall what Putin intended to do, the administration has done pretty well. I think, and I think the assembly of the coalition, of the alliance, and mobilization of NATO in both what they've done militarily and what they've done in terms of sanctions is a huge achievement. There's just no understating how important that is. And frankly, Putin was counting on just the opposite. Putin was counting on a divided, paralyzed West with weak governments, divided countries, and so on. So all of that is simply to say, I think walking this line of how much we can do while still avoiding the likelihood of a war with Russia is an important one, and I think they've walked that line pretty well. But as Russia becomes more ruthless, as the casualties mount, if they were to use a weapon of mass destruction, I think that calculus changes.
Yeah. I want to ask you to play Secretary of Defense Austin, but let me just ask a discrete question. What is it that you think they need that we are not either contemplating or directly providing them?
Well, one of the things that I think we ought to be very aggressively pursuing right now, because there is great urgency, is we don't really have time to get a lot of heavy American armor into Ukraine, and we don't, and there isn't time to train the Ukrainian military. But there is a lot of former Soviet military equipment still in the arsenals of East European states. Now, the Czechs have agreed to provide the Ukrainians. I've read the Czechs are prepared to provide the Ukrainians with Soviet tanks, both T-72s and T-55s. The Slovaks are prepared to transfer S-300 anti-air defense systems to the Ukrainians. That equipment is equipment that many of the Ukrainians have trained on, And there's a lot more of it in the former members of the Warsaw Pact. And so I think the United States ought to be acting 24/7. How do we mobilize that equipment? And how do we get it into Ukraine and into the hands of the Ukrainians, with a promise from the United States to backfill over time with our equipment for our NATO allies? But I think getting this armor, getting more sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses into place is critically important and critically urgent. And we ought to be sort of ransacking the arsenals of those states. And I think they would be cooperative, particularly if they were going to get an American backfill of more modern, better equipment that would naturally go to our NATO allies.
Before we move off, at least of the immediate situation in Ukraine, I wanted to ask you, it's not a philosophical question, it's a matter of strategy and strategy and commitment. And that is this. Genocide is not necessarily a matter of scale, it's a matter of intent. And I suspect a compelling case can be made that the Russians are practicing genocide in Ukraine. The notion, and I say this not just with respect to the United States, but the West in general, the notion of responsibility to protect or intervention to prevent mass killing. The slogan "Never Again" is a very uplifting one, but never again, if you look at the record of the West on humanitarian intervention to stop mass killing, is not never again at all. It's ever again. I mean, from the Nazi Holocaust to Cambodia, to Rwanda, to Darfur, to Congo, to Sudan, to Syria, to Myanmar, to the Uyghurs. So here you have a situation where, and you're right, as the offensive in the Donbass intensifies, the mass killing of civilians is going to escalate. How do you process that issue? We've declared genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And yet it seems to me we could help the Ukrainians win the war to stop the genocide. We could provide them with a more advanced military equipment, presumably aircraft and missile systems, to stop the delivery, maybe artillery. But how do you process our responsibility with respect to mass killing?
Well, I have always believed that, while responsibility to protect is a laudable objective, that it has to be seen in real world terms. And I think it has to be seen in terms of American governance. Are the American people prepared to send American young men and women to war to stop it? And you just reeled off a list of places where genocides have taken place, and they all have one thing in common. The United States did not send military forces to stop them. And so I think what we are trying to do to help the Ukrainians beat back the Russians, and the punitive measures we have taken against Russia, the gathering of the alliance to resist the Russians and to provide the Ukrainians with the wherewithal to do it, is probably the most effective thing we can do at this point to stop the killing, and now especially in eastern Ukraine, short of going to war ourselves. And I think that's just a fundamental fact of life.
Okay, so let's move to broader strategy questions that involve China and post Ukraine. And obviously how this conflict ends is going to obviously be critically important to what the United States does afterwards. In the wake of Afghanistan, people were absolutely persuaded that the United States would never lead again. Our adversaries would exploit our withdrawal and the chaos of the withdrawal. Our allies were beside themselves. And you know what they say, that a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk. And yet the administration even by your own standards, and I agree with you, has done pretty well in reversing the notion that America couldn't lead. You wrote in the Post, an intriguing article last month. Let me just quote it here. You say that Putin's invasion has been a cold shower needed to awaken the democracies to the reality of a new world in which our strategy, including the pivot to Asia, was, quote, woefully insufficient to meet the challenges we face. We cannot pretend, you continued, any longer that a national security focused primarily on China will protect our political, economic, and security interests. We have to devote attention to both. So you're calling for a recalibration, in essence, a larger role, integrated deterrence involving not just military force, but cyber, information, marshaling allies, economics, diplomacy, to reassert American leadership in the world. And I just wondered if you could, because the piece didn't do this, limited by time and space, as these pieces are, what are the objectives that the United States needs to achieve vis-a-vis Russia and China? Is it global primacy? Is it containment? Is it rollback? I'm assuming it's not regime change. Exactly what's our major objective? Our own self-image of our role vis-a-vis these countries. Compete, cooperate.
I think the fundamental responsibility of every American government is to protect the national security of the United States and its vital interests, period. And I think ideology and all the other instruments of power that you just described and that I write about in my book, Exercise of Power, are all required for that. And I think this is the one place where we have a lesson to learn from the Cold War. That contest with the Soviet Union took place against the backdrop of the greatest arms race in the history of the world. But there was never a direct confrontation. There was never a war, military war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But it was fought out all over the world through surrogates, but also through ideology, through economics, through technology, science, through strategic communications, through nationalism, and a whole host of different instruments, most of which we walked away from after the end of the Cold War. The United States Information Agency was eliminated by Congress in 1998. USAID was downsized dramatically and moved into a part of the State Department. And all you have to do is look at where we are in terms of our economic assistance programs compared with the Chinese Belt and Road proposals. A pivot to Asia. The problem with the phrase pivot to Asia is it makes it sound like we're going to focus all of our efforts in all of these arenas just in Asia, or just on China in Asia, and the same way with our military forces. But we face a situation today where China is the largest trading partner of virtually every country in Latin America. China and Russia, China is a trading partner of most of the countries in Africa. The Russians are putting military forces, mercenaries, into probably a half a dozen or 10 African countries. The Middle East still matters. People like to say, we're withdrawing. We don't want anything to do with the Middle East anymore. Well, you can't do that. And all of a sudden, for the first time since Henry Kissinger got the Soviets out of Egypt in 1973, the Egyptians are now buying arms from the Russians again. So this is a global contest that we're in, and our interests are global for a variety of reasons. And frankly, that's an issue that I think our politicians in both parties have failed in making the case to the American people why our interests are global. But I think that you have to have a strategy that understands that first of all, this is going to be a long contest in front of us. And second, it's a global contest. You can't just say we're going to pivot to Asia and think that takes care of your interests, because the Chinese activities are global. The Russians are becoming more aggressive globally. And then obviously you've got other powers like Iran and North Korea that you can't forget about. So I think we have to back up and say, okay, this is a global contest, and maybe the ideological umbrella over it all ultimately is democracy versus authoritarianism. But the reality is, in dealing with the very concrete challenges that Russia and China pose, we are going to have to take a page out of the playbook from the Cold War and have to do business and work with countries that aren't necessarily democracies. And
Right.
and that's just a fact of life.
I mean, you seem to be calling for, to quote one of my former boss, the late Madeleine Albright, one of my former bosses, in a phrase she borrowed from Bill Clinton, that the U.S. needs to be a sort of indispensable power. And I remember what de Gaulle said about the cemeteries of France being filled with indispensable people. So, I mean, is the notion that we can return, well, let me ask the question, I don't want to assert it. Can we return to a position where the United States emerged as the primary power in the world today? Do our interests demand that we do that on a global scale? I mean, you seem to be suggesting that that's at least the sort of self-image we need to adopt for ourselves. Is that
I think the danger of framing it that way is that it leads to the perception of U.S. as world policemen.
right?
And that we're going to take responsibility for dealing with every instability, every civil war, every genocide, everything that goes wrong. We're going to be there to fix it. And I think that is a level of ambition that the American people are not prepared to tolerate at this point. I think we need to frame it in terms of how do we protect our vital national interests, which are global. And I think what we do have is a unique convening power. No other country could have put together, could have roused the NATO alliance and put together the global coalition against Russia that the United States has put together. Just a fact of life. Nobody else could do that. That's where we have a capacity to be a leader. So rather than say, we're going to be the preeminent power or whatever, I would say we have a responsibility to lead democratic countries. And frankly, the challenge to their interests, we have benefited in a perverse sort of way from the behavior of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, because it's caught the attention of other countries around the world, not just our NATO allies, but Australia and Japan and in Vietnam and others, that these two powers are a risk to them, that these two powers are bullies, and that they want to take over and be the preeminent power. In Russia's case in Europe, in Central Asia, in China's case in Asia, and even more globally, their ambitions. If you look at Belt and Road and their strategic communications and so on. So I think the key is how do our political leaders calibrate and explain to the American people the kind of role we actually ought to have that doesn't lead us to get overly ambitious in terms of trying to fix problems around the world. But when there are challenges to our interests, we have the ability and the will to bring together alliances of others with others to protect our interests and theirs as well.
That's a very hard line to navigate, finding the right balance between means and ends.
Well, that's what leaders get paid for.
I would agree, and I'm showing my bias here, but I would argue to you that, frankly, again, admittedly it's my bias. The last time we found the right balance between means and ends, the right amount of risk aversion and risk readiness, the amount of political smarts, the molding of a domestic political consensus, which is actually critical to sustaining any foreign policy, was the first. We have to go back a long way. It was the first Bush administration. And,
you won't find me arguing with that.
right. So I mean, so it's the exception. It's not the rule for American foreign policy. And I worry greatly, which brings me to a question. I mean, our foreign policy, we live in a glass house now, Dr. Gates. We really do. Doesn't mean we can't promote democratic values. We can't lead the rest of the world. Ukraine has shown that. But the greatest challenges we confront now, even in the midst of this terrible, savage, brutal war in Ukraine, are the ones that we confront here. Our own dysfunction, our own polarization, our tribalization.
So I tell people, I get asked all the time, so what's the greatest national security threat to the United States? And my consistent response is it's found within the 2 square miles that encompass the White House and the Capitol building. Because in truth, if we can't get past not just our polarization, we've always had polarized politics. I mean, the stuff from the Jefferson-Adams race in 1800 would fit right into a presidential campaign today. What's different is paralysis and the inability to tackle big issues like education, immigration, and so on. And if we can't get that right, if we can't get past that kind of paralysis and polarization, that level of polarization, then there's really no foreign threat that's as consequential for our future. But I will say this, Aaron, I think President Biden has an opportunity here. Going back to what I was saying earlier, you really have a bipartisan significant bipartisan support in the Congress for dealing directly with Russia and China, for adopting policies that are designed to put us in a better position to meet those challenges. And I think that more focus, it's a building block. And it's something that I think, and there will be differences on tactics up there. There were huge differences on tactics during the Cold War. But there is the opportunity to put in place the kind of bipartisan, long-term consensus on the need to deal with those challenges, and even the broad parameters of how you deal with those problems. For example, the Defense Department and so on, and some of these other capabilities we talked about. There's an opportunity here. And I think it would be a mistake to miss it.
You served 8 presidents, and your service was performed during a period, despite the disagreements, despite the personalization of politics, it functioned between 2 sets of parameters. R's gave way to D's, D's to D's, D's to R's. The basic norms and institutions of what constituted peaceful transition of power and the institutions of this republic were respected and protected. I worry, and you're right about a fleeting moment of bipartisanship, courtesy of Vladimir Putin. But as we approach the midterms, as we go through the next 2 years in anticipation of the general in 2024, that frankly, not Ukraine, is my major concern. I mean, we've seen the enemy, frankly, and the enemy is us. And I'm a believer in the Republic. I think we'll get through it, but it's going to be extremely difficult. One final question for you. You write with great eloquence about the impact when you were Secretary of Defense of having to sign letters of condolence, laying in bed, weeping, you say, almost every night as you meditated on the dead and the wounded. And you conclude the book. It's powerful, Dr. Gates. I have to say, I get chilled when I think about it. You conclude the book by revealing that you are requested to be buried in Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery, the resting place of many of those we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. I guess my final question is this: of all the reasons and justifications to send American men and women into harm's way, what, in your view, is the essential, the sine qua non, that with which we cannot do without? And I realize the president makes these decisions in sending American men and women into battle. What needs to be present above everything else?
I think the president has to believe himself or herself, and has to be able to persuade the American people that risking those lives matters. That this isn't some unrealistic objective. That the president is giving them a mission they actually can perform and carry out, and that the president can look the parent or the Secretary of Defense can look a parent in the eyes and say, what your child did mattered, and it mattered for our country.
Thank you. And let me thank you again for your long service on behalf of the Republic, Dr. Gates, and the fact that you've been so honest and shared so much with us at Carnegie.
Thanks, Aaron. I enjoyed it.
Take care. Bye-bye.